welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Newsfirst. With me this evening is Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, Special Advisor on Political Economy in the SJB. Good evening, Kusum, and welcome back to the show.
Good evening, Niresh. Thanks for having me.
Right. So, Kusum, we are about 3 weeks away from the government's budget. No one knows yet what's in it because these things are top secret, except that maybe 2 days before there will be a rumor going around, which may be correct or not. That usually happens, but it's secret for now. But as the budget is being written, it is vital that Sri Lankans get involved and give their views of what should be in that budget. And you are representing the SJB, so I think this is a good opportunity for the main opposition party to speak about the focus of this budget, that, you know, these are the main points that perhaps the government should focus on. So let's start off with the poverty alleviation, which was one of the major issues. It brought about the downfall of the last regime when more than 25% of the population fell below the poverty line. And now with this government, there have been certain welfare measures which have been implemented, but we haven't seen the poverty level reducing in a big way. So what more needs to be done there?
Well, thanks, Niresh. I think I'm very glad that you brought up poverty as the first question, because I think that's the most urgent thing that we have right now. And I want to reiterate to the audience that poverty is not a matter of whether we should feel sorry or we should feel generous or anything like that. It's about the economy. A country can't have economic development if you have very high rates of poverty. You mentioned the 25% poverty rate. So 25% of our population is about 5.5 million people. But that's the poverty rate, and the poverty rate of monthly 17,000 rupees. So already it's a very low line of poverty, which is essentially, I would look at it more as like a survival rate. So the problem is that there was a household survey done by Learn Asia and CEPA, the Center for Poverty Analysis. They found at a minimum something like 8 million Sri Lankans that are living at or below the poverty line, or maybe just above. So as you can see, if you have 7, 8, 9 million people who are poor, you're going to have a very difficult time having any kind of sustainable growth. Now, you may see growth in pockets, but that growth becomes unsustainable because the benefits of that growth aren't being shared equally. So as you mentioned, this government, first thing you have to do is you have to put your money where your mouth is, and that's where the budget comes in. So this is a left progressive government, the NPP government. That's what we've been led to believe. If you read their manifesto, they were all about poverty reduction. But during their first budget, what did they actually allocate for this? I don't think they allocated even 1.4% of GDP to social assistance. Sri Lanka has generally had under 1.2% of GDP for social assistance. Anyone that thinks that Sri Lanka is a country that is doling out free cash to people all over the country, that's simply not happening. There is a Aswasuma program, there is a cash transfer program that's come about because of the rapid increase in poverty. So it's another important point. It's not only that we have 25% poverty and 8 million people who are poor. It's a fact that this was a very low rate previously, and it jumped from 5, 6, 10% to 20% to 25%. So these sharp inclines in this poverty rate, it brings social impacts and social issues. Now, one of the other issues that's coming up is that Aswasuma itself is set to expire. So it'll be interesting to see what the government does with Aswasuma. Aswasuma in itself was a replacement for Samurdhi, which was a cash transfer. Now, unfortunately, while cash transfers are essential for people, it's basically a stopgap. It's going to get you from 1 month to the other. But that, as you said, Niresh, is not going to take you out of poverty. What takes you out of poverty is building the ability and the resources to get yourself out of there, to get yourself a job, to learn new skills. Now, that is also part of poverty alleviation. So if you look at one of our first projects, poverty alleviation projects in Sri Lanka, Janasavya. Janasavya was what you call a hybrid poverty alleviation program, where it's not just a cash transfer, it's also a compulsory saving scheme. It's a way of getting additional skills. So, and these are quite popular in developing countries in Latin America, in places like Mexico, in places like Brazil. There's a very famous project called the Bolsa Familia, which provides, which even works in a way that you get extra stipends if you ensure that your children's vaccinations are up to date, if you ensure that they have high attendance levels at school. So it's a form of also improving social indicators. So I think the government has to go into, so the whole reason that the Sri Lankan government did away with Janasavya was because it was too costly to administer. But I think in the modern day, with the modern systems, with digitization, administration of such programs and poverty alleviation programs need not be so arduous. So I think that the government really needs to invest in a poverty alleviation program that is not just transferring cash, a small 6,000 rupee, 7,000 rupee amount every month. It's about finding a way to get people to improve their skills, to learn some new skills, and getting them into the job market so they have some way of sustaining themselves and their families. Right now, what's happening is that people cannot afford to upgrade themselves. Even if you're passing out of university, if you're passing out of A-levels, you can't then take the next step in the education ladder because you have to go to work. You have to provide for yourself, provide for your family. And working and getting these educational qualifications is also increasingly difficult. So in such a context, it's very difficult for people to get out of their current situation. So this lack of upward social mobility is a real problem in developing economies. So if you hit this middle income trap and you're unable to get large numbers of people out of the middle class, you're in trouble. If you were in this middle income setting and you had a large number of people fall in to the lower income deciles, you're going to be even bigger trouble. So that's the problem that we have right now.
Right. So we need to revamp the poverty alleviation system, and we have, as you said, over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've tried different systems. So perhaps it's time to relook at what we have and what we actually need.
It's also about prioritizing, because I think we have to understand that poverty and inequality, these are not peripheral issues. If you want your economy to develop, these are central issues, because there's no way for a country to develop. I know that Sri Lanka is considered to be a lower middle income country. It's called LMIC. But if you really consider the map of Sri Lanka, what you see is certain enclaves, little parts of little cities that are LMICs. Everything else basically falls into a low income category. But because there is extreme levels of wealth in certain pockets of the country, this pushes us into this LMIC category. But in reality, there's only a few people in our entire country that you can categorize as being in LMIC conditions. Everybody else is in a lower income condition.
So it's a false indicator, isn't it?
It's not accurate at all, yes.
Right.
It's a little bit like GDP per capita, which
Right.
says nothing about the actual the distribution of income in the economy. For that you need what's called Gini coefficient, for instance. A Gini coefficient will tell you on a base case of 100 whether how equal your society is. Now, obviously, there is no utopian ideal economy where everybody's equal. But in the best societies, in the most successful societies, there's a certain flow where people don't fall below that flow. And that, I think, was the case for Sri Lanka. Post-independence, many of the development agencies said that Sri Lanka was I think the phrase they used is that we are enjoying the fruits before they have the fruits of success before they have ripened, to say that we have introduced too many social programs before we have achieved a certain level of development. But 20 years later, those same development agencies like the World Bank, the ADB, they did a study and they realized that Sri Lanka actually, in terms of physical quality of life, in terms of our social indicators, we were matching some of even Scandinavian countries back in the 1970s. And then they realized that the social programs that we had in place have actually worked. On the other side, what they've said is we haven't funded them properly. And that's a revenue problem. So I think if I can go to the next issue that this government has to fix urgently, it's the revenue problem. Now, revenue is an incredibly tricky thing because nobody wants to pay tax. You, me, members, everyone watching, we are all paying far too much tax. If you're not paying much in income tax, I guarantee you, you're paying a lot in indirect taxes. You're paying a lot in VAT. You're paying a lot in import duty. If you're a member of the middle class, you probably went into 20, 30, 40 million rupees worth of debt to buy a brand new Toyota or SUV, maybe even a Chinese SUV. It'll still cost you 50 to 20 million rupees. That's debt. Nobody has 15, 20 million, 30 million rupees in the savings account or in FD. If you do, good for you, but the majority of the country is not there. So you understand, with these kinds of costs, with these kinds of taxes, how is the economy going to develop? For an economy to develop, Niresh, you and I need to have money in our pockets so that we can go and buy a product. So that disposable income has to be there, savings has to be there, and investment rates have to be there. Currently, Sri Lankans are surviving month to month. If 8 million people are poor, at least 10, 12 million people are living month to month. That means, and we know food insecurity is extremely high. We know that a lot of people are basically giving up meals to save money, right? So these are not indicators that are going to help. So if you don't fix the revenue issue, which every single development organization, the IMF, the World Bank, they've been telling us for decades that we have not developed our revenue. And there are countries like, for example, Georgia. Georgia, within 4 years, it went from under 10% tax to GDP to almost 20%. Mexico, a very complex, large country, a large, complex society, they were able to increase tax to GDP in a hurry. So these things happen, but it again needs investment. You have to invest in the IRD, you have to invest in customs, you have to bring in digitization, you have to bring in systems. That costs money. It's not easy. But, and I've said this before, if Sri Lanka does not have historic generational investments in our Inland Revenue Department and in the customs, Sri Lanka's revenue will never get anywhere. We will just about scrape the edge of this IMF target of 15% tax to GDP, which is just about enough to manage our economy. It's not enough to make the investments in the people and in our economy and develop.
Right. You spoke of taxation, and there's a correlation to the migration of skilled people out of Sri Lanka. When the last government introduced a high rate of personal income tax, you saw, doctors, engineers, the skilled people departing en masse. And we need to retain those people. And even now, yes, this government did reduce that taxation somewhat, but they didn't come anywhere close to what they had promised. And the taxation, the personal income tax, remains high. What are your views on this? Should it be reduced?
To be honest, Niresh, personal income taxes in Sri Lanka, the tax slab structure is not progressive enough. So what's happening is, even if you're a top executive in Sri Lanka, let's say you make $1 million a month, you're going to be paying 24, 25, 26% on that 1 million rupees progressively, right? So that means, 25% for $1 million, I think is a little too much, because so if you're making 500,000 to $1 million a month, that means you're in the top executive grade on this country, and you're in a position to move up the ladder. So these are the people in this aspirational middle class, upper middle class. These are the people who will make those investments in the future. They are the people who will invest in a business someday. They will build a house for the next generation. They are the people who are socially mobile up this economic ladder. Now, right now, that's not going to happen, because there is no social mobility. People who are living middle class lifestyles can now barely afford that middle class lifestyle. Many of them will go into debt to maintain that level of consumption. And that's another very big risk. So I really think that unless the government focuses on how to expand the tax net, you and I will keep paying more and more tax, because that's what every government does. They keep taxing the people who are already paying tax, income tax. And there's a large informal sector. There's a huge cash-only sector. And that's a fact. That's not my opinion. If you look at the statistics, because the numbers don't lie, Neeraj. The numbers say that Sri Lanka has a very low income tax to GDP ratio compared to peer group. Our income tax to GDP ratio has been less than 1.5% for decades. You have to have 2.5% income tax to GDP. So even though you and I are paying a very high level of tax, maybe our income tax levels are not as high, but we're paying a lot in VAT and import duty. If you're paying an income tax rate, you can bet that someone who's earning 4 or 5 million rupees isn't paying as much as they should, because our tax structure isn't progressive enough. So it tops out at about 36%. So whether you're making 3 million rupees a month, or you're like some of the other former presidential candidates who are making 16 million rupees a month, your rate isn't going to change that much. And that's a problem, because there are people in our economy who will make 3, 4, 5, 6 million rupees a month. That's not uncommon at the upper echelons of our corporate sector. But those people are all still paying 35, 36%, whereas someone who's making 2 million will also be paying almost 30%. So those differences, that is not a progressive difference. So we have to first ensure that the people who can afford to pay are paying. And then of course our corporate sector, again, it's not that I have anything against corporates, it's that the statistics and the data shows that Sri Lanka's corporate tax to GDP is lower than our peer group, and it has been so for 10-15 years. So again, that has to improve. So unless we attack this, and remember, Niresh, even this current budget, it increased tax revenue in a big way, but most of that tax revenue came from VAT and vehicle import duties. During the first 6 months of this year, our government, our treasury has earned about $500 million in import duty from vehicles. Just in import duty from vehicles in the first 6 months of this year, $500 million in a country where it's 8 million people are poor. So you already see that there's an imbalance here. And these kinds of imbalances where you have these enclaves of super rich and the rest of the country can barely make ends meet, it's not sustainable. So I think, as we said, poverty alleviation and getting tax revenue from the people that have the money. That's the most important thing next.
Right, and you touched on the vehicle tariffs. What do you think? I mean, when the tariff was, when vehicles were allowed in earlier this year, there was a lot of debate about it. And you do see a large number of vehicles which have been brought in. Should that continue, or should it be better regulated?
To be honest, there's two ways of looking at this. Now we just know, we have a revenue issue, we have a tax revenue issue. One of the things that people around the world talk about, because this tax revenue issue, funnily enough, is not unique to Sri Lanka. Even advanced countries like the UK, they have a tax revenue issue. Even the US has a revenue issue, right? So in Sri Lanka, for instance, we don't have a wealth tax. So a lot of countries are now thinking of introducing a wealth tax. But the way I see these vehicle taxes is, it is a form of a wealth tax. It's a very poorly targeted wealth tax. Unfortunately, even people who can't afford it will go in for a lease, will go in for one of these finance schemes, and they will pay 28 million or 30 million rupees for a Toyota Corolla, right? Because it's an aspiration, because you've worked 10-15 years, you've reached a certain position in your company, you have earned the right to drive a car of some quality because of the last 15 years of working. But then the government says, well, you have to pay 200% extra. And you say, okay, I'll do it. But that's you shouldn't have to do that. You're a member of the middle class. You should be saving this. If your Toyota Corolla is 10 million and you spend 30 million, that's a 20 million gap, which you could have spent on something else, a business, your child's education, a second house as an investment property. There are things you can do with that money, but instead you spent it all on a vehicle because that's what people are doing, right? I don't mind if people want to spend 150 million rupees for a Range Rover. I don't mind, because that's tax revenue. And if you can afford it, by all means, if you're spending 50, 60, 70 million rupees on a vehicle and upwards, Niresh, you can clearly afford it. You should be paying that tax. But I think for these lower vehicles, the smaller vehicles, for some of the smaller EVs, for the small engine vehicles, you have to give people some relief. But now that they've increased these tariffs and people have gone in for leases, you have created an asset bubble. So if you reduce the prices suddenly even by 10%, those people have taken borrowings where now their asset that's covering that borrowing is less valuable by 10-15%. And that's a problem for them, right? So this is why when you increase tariffs on imports, on goods like vehicles, you create these asset bubbles. And when there's an asset bubble, you have a risk. So that's why I don't think the government can certainly reduce taxes on vehicles. And I don't think they can stop imports, because they're depending, a large part of the revenue growth is driven by customs, by import duties. That's why, because we're not generating enough income tax. We're not generating enough corporate tax. So we're making up for it on VAT, and we're making up for it import taxes. That's what everybody will pay that.
Interesting take there. So your advice is basically keep it as it is.
Keep it as it is, and if you can, find a way to reduce the taxes on the smaller vehicles, the vehicles that the middle class are looking for, so that they can at least save some money and get ahead.
Another contentious issue, the CEB tariff. We have been told a few days back that for 3 months we've got a respite. No increase in tariffs, but we don't know come January, February what it's going to be like. What is the situation? Can households afford this, an increase? can businesses, exporters afford this? We already have a very high power tariff.
Yes, Niresh. So this is something that is an issue in many developing countries. Utilities are usually a drag on an economy. That's how they're viewed. So I think you're very familiar with Margaret Thatcher's era in the UK, which is one of the most famous instances of SOE privatizations in the world. And many people consider it to be successful. I have my own point of view. But they also privatized parts of the electricity sector. Now, the electricity sector, I think generally has 3 or 4 major areas. So you have generation, you have transmission, you have retail, and I think the unbundling of the Ceylon Electricity Board is essential in the sense of you have to have what is called, because I think we use this term privatization, right? You can use the word privatization, or you can look at it as private participation, right? So why do you have privatizations and private participations in utilities? It's because you want to make utilities more efficient, because your government can't afford it, and because you want to lower the price for the consumer. Now, what's happening in Sri Lanka right now, Niresh, and it's happening right across our economy in every decision that the government makes, is that we are making decisions based on the IMF program and the IMF intended targets. So even the electricity board, the liberalization of the electricity sector, all of this is being looked at from the point of view of cost reflective pricing, from the point of view of covering up for the losses at the CEB. Now, Niresh, electricity is such a core component of everybody's lives, of every economy. It feeds into every part, whether you're manufacturing a good, whether you're in an office providing a service, whether you're living at home, whether you're running a bit, whatever you do, the electricity costs a major component. Electricity costs Sri Lanka has one of the highest electricity costs in the region, right? And a country that is underdeveloped with high electricity costs, it doesn't make sense. Every country that's developed, all developing countries, provide some form of electricity subsidies to lower income groups, to businesses, to their key industrial sectors. Now in Sri Lanka, we have a little bit of that, but they're very poorly targeted. There is no plan for this. If Sri Lanka, for example, wants to focus on exports, in order for exports to be competitive, they have to be cheap. One of the main components of manufacturing is energy. So you have to look at your energy sector, your electricity board, from the point of view of your exports. You can't just say, we have cost reflective pricing. No, the cost has gone up, increase the rate. Because Niresh, in an economy, if you and I are paying 30% more on electricity, that 30% I'm not able to spend on goods. I'm not able to spend in the economy. So what people have to understand is the CEB cannot be on a road to recover its past losses. Because remember that your energy price is the cost of the entire CEB. It's not just the cost of the energy. It's the cost of the guy in the office. It's the cost of his vehicle. It's the cost of his driver. It's the cost of all the people that they hire around the country, all the engineers. So let's be honest. I think there was a big controversy about a new building also that the CEB had put up. And that was part of they were claiming that this is part of the reason that they have had to increase the electricity tariff. There was another issue in terms of whether you bring in revenue into this period, whether you take the cost into the other period. We know that some of the engineers aren't taking the cost of renewables accurately. That's something that's been a bit controversial. It's been written about. So you can see the CEB has a huge lack of transparency. So, and all we are doing is we are only looking at the CEB from the point of view of the IMF. And the IMF have made some statements regarding this about how they have to continue the liberalization of the energy sector. And I agree with this, but you have to do it with a certain strategy. So again, this upcoming budget, it has to show us a budget for a government and a country must come from an overarching strategy. It cannot just be about satisfying the IMF. By all means, try to cover your costs in the CEB, but not at the expense of the ordinary person. Like you said, the ordinary person has to be able to afford to do other things in his life. He can't pay 300% extra on a car, 30% extra on water, and 60-70% extra on electricity compared to say 2020, 2021, and then expect the country to develop. A country can develop if people have disposable incomes, and electricity is a major component. It's one of the main things that went up after the collapse. So instead of finding ways to reduce the cost to the consumer, our whole focus is on cost reflective pricing. Why? Because we're worried about the primary account surplus. So if your whole end game is primary account surplus, wait until the IMF program finishes in 2027 and then start your development program. If that's the way public policy is going to work, Niresh, come 2027, 2028, you and I will be having this conversation about another restructuring. And I can assure you, the projections in the IMF data that they have on their website, it shows by 2027, 2028, we will be spending about 40, 50, 60% of revenue on interest payments. We will have an external debt stock of about 50% of GDP. About 60% of all our external debt will be ISBs. And ISB stock only grows until you restructure it. So this is what's going to happen. It's not that we are going to collapse like the Gotabaya era. That took something very special, right? What's going to happen is by 2027, 2028, when our reserves are once again being used to settle debts, when we have to make $5 billion every year, when we're borrowing ISBs, our cost of living will increase because the rupee will come under pressure. When that happens, our imports prices will increase, cost of living goes up. It will be a repeat. And what happens then is that you lose political continuity, right? Even if you have a bad plan, you have to follow it through. What's happened is we have one bad plan, the government will not be popular enough to follow it through, and another group will come in with another bad plan. So the SJB is standing here saying, we have a plan. We had a very clear manifesto about improving our exports and diversifying and upgrading the external sector. None of that has happened. The NPP governments made a big play about industrialization, about an industrial plan. They talked about upgrading manufacturing, special economic zones. None of this has come to pass. The only thing that...
Kusum, it strikes me, and I've been doing this show a few years now, it strikes me that whenever we start talking about the economy, it boils down to the IMF. And we sort of digress into, well, according to the IMF plan, this has to be done, the CEB, there has to be cost-effective pricing and so on. And that basically holds our economic growth hostage in a way, because we can't seem to focus on getting our economy going because of all these. I mean, it's not just the CEB. There are, as you said, other issues as well, taxation, poverty alleviation, all that. But it all seems to boil down to the IMF plan. And I'm not blaming the IMF. We needed them. We asked them to come in. We should have asked them to come in several years before that. And thank goodness that, they did come in and we managed something. Fine. But shouldn't we, Sri Lankans, be thinking beyond the IMF?
So, Niresh, this is exactly my point. It's not about demonizing the IMF. We know the government, before the members of the MPP and the JVP came into government, came into parliament, we know what their rhetoric was about the IMF. I have never referred to the IMF as a neo-colonial institution. That is the members of the NPP. I have never said that the IMF are out to crush the global south. Those are members of the NPP. I have never said that the IMF are economic hitmen. Those were members of the SLPP, and the SJB has always viewed the IMF in the way that they should be. They are not a development partner. They are a solvency and liquidity partner, and you have to utilize them and utilize their tools. Now, there is nothing wrong in reaching the intended targets of the IMF. In fact, we have to. The point is that we have to go beyond these targets. For example, the revenue target, the 15% tax to GDP target that they're giving us is a minimum. But we aim for the minimum as if we are aiming for heaven. But the fact of the matter is 15% is the minimum that we should be able to achieve. Sri Lanka had almost 20% tax to GDP in the early 90s. I think 1989, 1990, 1991, if you check, we have 18, 19% tax to GDP. So how could we, in 1990, when we had no digitization, no banking systems, no online banking, none of these things, but we were able to generate 20%. Now people say it's impossible for Sri Lanka to reach 15%. Our formal sector is just too big. Our cash-only sector is just, people will never... With these kinds of attitudes, Niresh, we will be stuck here in the same thing. So the point is, the IMF will give you a set of guidelines, meet them, but then you have to have your own plan. The IMF is not going to give us an industrial policy. The IMF is not the reason that Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Taiwan, South Korea, China, in these countries developed not because they produced a primary account surplus. That's not why they developed. They developed because they had industrial plans, because they developed their external sectors. So we have watched 30 years of countries around this region exponentially growing. Vietnam, which also had a destructive war and half their country was blown up, they are now in the top 10 trading partners of the USA, right? So then someone will say, oh, but they have 70 million people. Okay, Hong Kong, how many million people do they have? How many million people do Singapore have? How did they develop? So there's all these excuses. People say we are too small, our people are too lazy, they're not educated enough, we don't have the infrastructure. Yes, all these things may be true. That's why you have to make these investments. People aren't automatically going to become educated and high skilled. The government has to make investments in that. People don't fall from the sky. So if you don't make these investments, where are these people? No, people say we can be a service-oriented economy. To be a service-oriented economy, what do you need? You need professionals. You need finance experts. Are we developing professionals and finance experts at a rate? No, they go abroad and you develop them, right? We need research and development. Where are the top engineers? They're abroad. So as you said, the migration is also an issue, but people aren't migrating because of taxes. They're migrating because they get no value back from the taxes that they pay, because they pay 25-30% and they don't use public health, they don't use public transport, they don't use social services. So then they wonder, my roads are bad, crime is going up, the police are corrupt. So what's the point in me paying 25-30% tax? I'll go abroad where I'll still pay 30-35% tax, but I get something back. I'll have good schools for my kids. I'll have a safe neighborhood to be in. I have opportunity to go up in life. Obviously, you're going to go abroad. Why would you stay in Sri Lanka when it doesn't seem like anything's going to develop? So, as I said, the government has to first have a strategy before it launches a budget. So, I have a feeling this budget will just continue in the same vein as the last year, and you and I will have to have a similar conversation in 6 months' time.
Oh dear, I certainly hope not. Exports. Again, lofty expectations. Our exports have to do this and do that and do the other. What do we need to get there?
So Niresh, there's two reports that came up recently. One in the Financial Times, it talks about our terms of trade. So essentially what we see is that merchandise exports, for example, grew by about 7%. In that same period, imports grew by 12%, right? So
that doesn't work.
Doesn't work. So if your terms of trade are depreciating and I think the base year they used was 2010. So in 2010, the base case would, if you take the base case as 100, I think we would have come down to about 85 or something by 2022 or 2023. So that's a decline. There was another article that talked about the net international investment position, the NIIP. So that basically is your total stock of foreign assets versus your foreign liabilities. So in Sri Lanka's case, foreign assets is just your foreign exchange reserves, and your foreign liabilities is your debt. So in 2012, we had a negative NIIP of about 36 billion. In 2018, it rose to 49 billion, and in 2024, it's about 55 billion. So we have a continuous decline in both terms of trade and our net investment position. So neither of these is promising. What this means is that our exports are less valuable in the international market. Even though our exports have grown in terms of their total quantum, the value of the exports are reducing. So this is a problem with having what is essentially a rudimentary commodity-based export sector. We have a few exports. I think you may be familiar, Niresh, with the tier system of international trade. So you start with tier 0 or tier 1, which is basically commodity exporters, people who export raw materials like tea, like rubber. Then you go in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. Tier 4 is basically an original brand manufacturer. It's a country and a company that develops, designs, manufactures, exports, markets, everything from that country. And then there are other countries like OEM countries, which is like China, which is basically a original equipment manufacturer. So Adidas will give a factory in China all the details and all the plans, and the Chinese factory just develops the shoe. Sri Lanka doesn't exist in the tier 3, tier 4, and we have 1 or 2 companies in tier 2, and we have a few auto components that are tier 1.5, like that. So if we don't start investing in companies that have potential to go up in these tiers, we will keep selling the same goods. And I mean, the garment industry is a godsend for us. From the 1990s, we're still dependent on it. But we have to now move up the technology ladder into high technology items. That's where you can actually capture value within the economy.
Right. What about SMEs, small, medium enterprises?
So, Niresh, I believe there's a link between the middle class and SMEs. SMEs come from the middle class. As we discussed, it is the middle class person who's been working for 15, 20 years, who's developed, generated some savings, they have money to invest in a small business. That's what they do. That's an SME, right? Is that going to happen in this context with a market that's showing virtually no growth? I recall there's 5% growth in the last quarter. I looked into the figures. The 5% growth came from infrastructure, construction, garments, yes, and tourism, right? All of the things I mentioned, they drive imports. Even tourism, it drives imports, because most of the tourists, when they come here, they stay at a hotel, they eat. We import most of our food stuff. Hotels import most of their supplies. So as you have, for every dollar that a tourist spend, we have to spend some part of that dollar to import items for them. So when you have construction, again, items are imported. So you have to understand that as you, even with tourism, if you don't have a value capture in the country, if the margins are thin, then it will just be money coming in and coming out. So I think, again, even with tourism, for instance, the next budget should have a system to actually calculate how much we really generate from tourism revenue, because we actually don't have a system. All you see when someone says we're going to make $5 billion or we made $4 billion from revenue from exports, that's an estimate. That's based on surveys when they leave the airport. That's based on some random room rate that they chose. But I think we know in Arugambe, for instance, we know that there are hundreds of Israeli tourists that come here and work and don't pay tax. They don't have authorization to work here. We know this is happening with some Russian communities, Ukrainian communities. We know that they use card systems where the money doesn't even come to our local system. This is happening right now. So a country that is so dependent on tourism doesn't have a system to calculate how much revenue we actually make from tourism. It's not finding a way to get high value tourists. It's allowing tourists to slip through the cracks and work in Sri Lanka without paying tax. And it's allowing people to basically front businesses but give the ownership to a foreigner and act as like the local agent. You can do any of these things if you formalize them and you regulate them. But none of that is happening. Instead, what you see is local mafias running tourist industries. You see ad hoc development, illegal structures. There are parts in the south where even on a poor day, you can go and get a drink, right? So I'm not saying good or bad. What I'm saying is there should be equal laws and regulations for everybody. In some parts of the country, you're over-regulated. In other parts of the country, you haven't seen anyone from the tourist board at all. I read that we haven't had a global promotion for tourism in 15 years. So are we being serious? If a country like Sri Lanka hasn't had a global tourism brand, it's probably a good thing, Niresh, that we didn't have a global tourism promotion campaign, because we don't have a strategy. We would have spent millions of dollars on a tourism promotion campaign without any overarching strategy and wasted, another small part of our GDP.
And we are almost out of time. So one final area, public transport. A lot is expected here because we're running the same types of trains and buses that our grandfathers saw on on the tracks and on the streets. So there are plans, especially with public buses, but we don't see much in the way of railways. So what's your feeling about that?
Well, Niresh, once again, we can connect our conversation about the vehicle imports, right? Everyone wants to import a vehicle because a vehicle is a status symbol. Part of the reason for that is because no one wants to use public transport. But that's not how advanced economies work. In an advanced economy, even the CEO will take a train. Even the CEO will take a bus because they're quality services. So what I want people to understand very clearly is that as a country develops, the public services in that country also improve. There is nowhere in the world where as the country develops, the government starts giving up public services. That doesn't happen. As you move up the economic development ladder, people expect better services. So in Sri Lanka, you can see we have had decades of GDP growth, Niresh. Have our public services improved? You can go to any southern coastal city, tourist hub, have their schools improved? Have the road, if you go away from the main tourist area, Have those roads in those villages changed? Those people's lives are exactly the same, other than the people who own the tourist businesses. Everybody else is living exactly the same life that their parents did. And their children will live the same lives that they did. And this is the problem, because generations of Sri Lankans will see the entire world come and go before them. And now with social media, you see what's happening in other countries. People in Sri Lanka who think that China is about cheap production and cheap labor, they have no idea what they're talking about. Chinese labor is now more expensive than Mexican labor. China is now an engineering technology giant. The days of made in China being a cheap tag, it's gone. In Sri Lanka, we will forever be doing the same products in the same way, the same tourist destinations, and you will see a massive skyscraper right next to a bunch of slums. So you can see just from this, even our tourism sector is under threat because of a lack of planning and a lack of regulation. So the government has to do a lot of things. It has to have the money to do them. So as we said, you can't fix railways, you can't fix tourism without growing your tax revenue base. And unfortunately, that's just a message that this government doesn't seem to have gotten.
Right, and I'm afraid we're out of time. My thanks to Kusum Wijetilleke, Special Advisor on Political Economy in the SJV. Thank you very much for being with us this evening, Kusum.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
Right, and well, it's time for us to leave you, and don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great weekend.